Összegzésről hadd olvassak el néhány gondolatot. Már kétszer egy történelmi és szellemi helyreállítás irányába nyit ajtót, ami egyszerre visszatérés is az eredeti bibliai ígérethez. A világ minden népe Ábrahám utódjában, vér szerinti örökösében talál áldást és beteljesülést. Aki azt gondolja, hogy Jesua népe nélkül, történelme nélkül, identitása nélkül egy transzcendes lényé változott, az nem értette meg az Atya isteni tervét. Aki Ábrahámnak tett ígéretétől tudatosan és folytonosan építette föl azt a közösséget, akinek a tapasztalata, tudása, történelme Jesua minden porcikájában benne van, és aki ábrahámi leszármazottként, azaz zsidóként indult el az Atya kijelölt útján, zsidó rabbiként minden népek felé. Ezekkel a gondolatokkal ajánlom ezt a filmet minden mélyen gondolkodó ember figyelmébe. Egy radikális gondolatmenet részesei lehetünk a most következő bő 25 percben, pedig felvetéseinek kézenfekvőnek kéne lennie minden keresztény számára, hiszen 2000 év állt rendelkezésre a feldolgozásukra. Én azt javaslom, hogy érdemes a felvételt időről időre megállítani és végig gondolni a felvetések súlyát és következtetéseit. És azt gondolom, hogy még hosszú távon is feladatot fog adni ez az előadás, mert olyan botlatóköveket tesz a bevett keresztény gondolkodás elé, amiket, hogyha igaznak fogadjuk el a felvetéseket, egy szellemi megújulás felé nyit kaput a számunkra. Már kétszer világszerte köztiszteletben álló teológus a lényeghez nyúl. A kereszténység központi személyének, a názáreti Jézusnak az identitásához. És azt mondja, hogy a történelmi zsidó Jézus és a Biblia és az evangéliumok által is elénk tárt örökre zsidó Jézus, a valóságos Jézus, és a bevett keresztény Jézus kép között egy szakadék tátog, egy ellentmondás feszül. Márk diadalittasnak, nagyhatalminak és agresszívnek nevezi ezt a bevett keresztény Jézus képet. És azt mondja, hogy ezt az ellentmondást, ezt a szakadékot úgy lehet áthidalni, ha visszatérünk a valódi, a bibliai és az evangéliumok által is örökre zsidónak bemutatott Jézushoz. És ezen felül úgy is megismerjük őt, mint a zsidó nép királyát. Számos kérdést vet föl ez a súlyos gondolatmenet. Például azt, hogy lehet, hogy a kereszténység szétszakította Jézust a népétől, és így zsidó identitásától is megfosztotta. Hogyan torzította a bevett keresztény Jézus képet ez a szakítás? Kicsoda a zsidó nép örökre zsidó messiása és a zsidó nép királya? És milyen hatással van ez a zsidó nép, a zsidó közösség és a keresztények kapcsolatára?
In anticipation of this event, the organizers put together this booklet entitled Jesus, King of the Jews. And in this booklet I have a short article called Is Jesus of Nazareth Still King of the Jews? It's more of a popular presentation, but it contains a few central claims which are at the heart of what I will also be presenting here. I'm not going to repeat them, simply pointing you to that article, which you could probably digest rather quickly if you haven't read it already. Jesus as eternally a Jew. The Jewishness of the historical Jesus is now taken for granted. But the reality and significance of Jesus' enduring Jewish identity is only gradually becoming a subject of theological reflection. At the beginning of this century, Robert Jensen, the eminent American Lutheran theologian that was mentioned earlier today, pointed to its significance, and I quote, "The risen Jesus is also flesh, in that he is risen bodily. For to be an embodied creature is to be flesh. Now, flesh is never an individual possession. That we are flesh means, among other things, that we have parents and ancestors, who, at least until we get to Adam, are not everyone's parents and ancestors. The Word who has come in the flesh belongs to the lineage of Abraham and Sarah, and this fact belongs to his identity, to what traditional Christology calls the one hypostasis of the Word who is Jesus." End of quote. Jensen describes the resurrected Jesus as the bearer of Jewish flesh and suggests that this is an essential feature of his glorified identity. Moreover, he proposes that this identity implies an enduring association with those of the same lineage, namely the Jewish people. In the same year, Bruce Marshall, a Catholic theologian, offered a similar proposal in even more explicit language. When Bruce Marshall wrote this, he may not have been a Catholic theologian. He was a theologian, but he may not have yet been a Catholic. I quote, "In the person of the Logos, God makes his own the flesh of this particular Jew, Jesus of Nazareth. God's ownership of this Jewish flesh is permanent. In the end, when all flesh shall see the glory of the Lord, the vision of God will, so the traditional Christian teaching goes, be bound up ineluctably with the vision of this Jew seated at God's right hand. So, in willing his own incarnation, it seems that God wills the permanence, indeed the eschatological permanence, of the distinction between Jews and Gentiles. But Jesus cannot be a Jew or be identified as such, as he will be even in the eschaton, all by himself, in isolation from his people. He is a Jew like any other only in virtue of his descent from Abraham, and thus in virtue of his relationship to the Jewish people as a whole. And this suggests that in owning with unsurpassable intimacy the particular Jewish flesh of Jesus, God also owns the Jewish people as a whole, precisely in their distinction from us Gentiles. He cannot own the one without also owning the other. End of quote. Marshall's formulation could not be clearer. God's ownership of this Jewish flesh is permanent. And since Jewish identity is inherently corporate, the resurrected Jesus retains a distinctive relationship with the Jewish people as a whole. Marshall infers from this the striking claim that Jewish identity itself carries over into the eschaton. Neither Jensen nor Marshall explored the wide-ranging ramifications of these bold assertions. Nor have many other prominent theologians of this century ventured further along the same path. But two recent volumes, one by Keiko Driediger-Hesslein and the other by Barbara Meyer, have done just that. Each reflects deeply on the Jewish identity of the resurrected Jesus. Barbara Meyer's Jesus the Jew in Christian Memory is of particular interest, since it gives more attention to the implications of Jesus' ongoing Jewish identity for the church's relationship to the Jewish people. Like Jensen and Marshall, Meyer takes seriously the resurrection of Jesus and the traditional Christology of the ecumenical councils, and reflects on the Jewishness of Jesus in that context. In doing so, she acknowledges the novelty of such a project. Quote, Jesus was a Jew, and it is correct for Christians to say that Jesus Christ is Jewish and will always remain Jewish. Yet, historical Jesus research, on the one hand, and traditional Christology, on the other, remain at odds. Hundreds of books have been written about the historical Jesus, and quite a few about Jesus the Jew in history. Christologies focusing on Jesus the Jew that use the present tense are fewer. End of quote. Like Jensen and Marshall, Meyer also perceives that the Jewishness of the resurrected Jesus implies his ongoing relationship with the Jewish people, and so also with the shape-shifting historical reality of Jewish identity. Quote, speaking about Jesus in the present tense seems to belong to an exclusively Christian confessional language. But here we see that Christology is not just concerned with historical Judaism, but also has a stake in contemporary Jewish self-understanding as well as everything that happened in between, from post-Second Temple Jewish history to the present. End of quote. Moreover, since the resurrected Jesus is also the Jesus of Olam Haba, the world to come, one must add Christological assertions in the future tense and reckon with the necessary implications concerning Jewish identity. Quoting again from Meyer, what does it mean that Jesus Christ will be Jewish? We do not know how Jewishness will be expressed at the end of times. Jewishness was differently expressed in the 1st and 21st centuries. What we do know, however, is that this Jewish self-expression will not be disconnected from other Jewish lives. End of quote. Meyer's concluding sentence, which I haven't yet read, to the paragraph just cited, highlights the central thesis of her entire volume. And here's the quote. This means that Jesus' otherness for Christian non-Jews will not be dissolved either. Let me just read that again. This means that Jesus' otherness for Christian non-Jews will not, even in the eschaton, be dissolved either. As she states in her introduction, quote, my key argument is that the Jewishness of Jesus Christ engenders an otherness that opens up new intellectual, spiritual, and ethical horizons for the non-Jewish Christian. End of quote. She builds here on the philosophical exploration of otherness in the work of Levinas and those influenced by him. Since the overwhelming majority of Christians are non-Jews, the Jewish identity of Jesus creates a potentially fruitful distance between the Master and those who in other respects are united to him by faith and baptism. And since his Jewish identity has content only in relation to the life of the Jewish people throughout history, it also establishes a potentially fruitful dependence of his disciples on the life and tradition of a community external to their own immediate socio-cultural identity. Meyer employs the term vulnerability to describe this fruitful dependence. Quote, Jesus' Jewishness is the most apparent signifier of Christianity's vulnerability. With Jesus the Jew at its heart, the Christian faith cannot succeed in isolation, but holds an inbuilt connection to Judaism and Jesus. After overcoming the aggression of rejecting this bond, Christians have the chance to experience the blessings of connectedness. Vulnerability is increased by attachment, but so is the vitality of the Christian community. I would go so far as to connect the vitality of Christ himself to the Christian attachment to the people of Israel. End of quote. But what about Jewish disciples of Jesus? Meyer acknowledges our existence and the fact that our relation to the Jewish Jesus differs from that of Gentile Christians. After asserting that, quote, the Jewish Jesus can never be in the Christian's domestic domain, end of quote, she includes a qualifying footnote. And here's the footnote: except for people of Jewish family background and Christian belief, whether they understand themselves as Christian Jews or Jewish Christians, end of quote. But she never explicitly affirms the theological significance of that difference or details its meaning. Meyer has taken the discussion further than those who preceded her, but there is still further to go. Jesus as the present and past King of the Jews. Meyer teaches at the University of Tel Aviv. The Jewish-Christian conversation occupies a central place in her life, as well as in her theology. In the first words of her acknowledgments, the author identifies herself as, quote, an anti-missionary Christian theologian. While she discusses Jewish views of Jesus, her primary audience consists of Gentile Christians, and her primary purpose consists in persuading that audience of its Christological dependence upon the Jewish people. Jesus is himself dependent upon the Jewish people for an essential aspect of his own identity, and as a result, the followers of Jesus, who do not share his Jewish identity, need the Jews to be themselves so that their resurrected master can continue to be himself. Meyer's allergic reaction to Christian missionary efforts towards Jews, a reaction I fully appreciate and have at times shared, prevents her from entertaining a proposition that goes beyond Jesus' Jewish identity, namely, that he is and forever will be the King of the Jews, and thus also the Lord of Jewish identity. This also takes us beyond the preliminary Christological soundings of Jensen and Marshall. If Jesus is the King of the Jews, he is indeed dependent upon them, for the word king, like the word father, is intrinsically relational in meaning. A king without subjects is no king. But the subjects of this peculiar king, who uniquely is both human and divine, depend upon him even more than he depends upon them. The precise character of this dependence remains a mystery. For the presence of the resurrected Jesus has gone largely unrecognized by the family over whom he reigns. But if in fact this particular Jew, who was crucified as the King of the Jews, has been raised from the dead, and if in his resurrection he remains the King of the Jews, and if he is both human and divine, then over them he truly does reign. Explicit, though fragmented, witness to the resurrected one through word and sacrament has been maintained historically only in the life of the church, a community largely composed of those who are not his natural subjects. This establishes a hidden mutuality between the Jewish people and the church, a mutuality denied by Meyer, for whom Jesus is a Jew, but not clearly the king of the Jews, and for whom Christians are dependent upon Jews, but Jews are not marked by the same relational vulnerability. Whenever Jesus is acknowledged by members of either community to be the king of the Jews, this hidden mutuality becomes manifest. Such people realize that they must look to and receive from members of another community and tradition in order fully to be themselves. Only few on either side now confess Jesus to be the resurrected King of the Jews, and who discern the communal mutuality this confession entails. Historical blinders, providentially permitted, still limit the epistemological capacities of these two intertwined communities, but their mutual dependence remains an ontological fact. Speaking as one of those Jews referred to in Meyer's footnote, and as also one who confesses Jesus to be the King of the Jews, I would propose that Jewish disciples of Jesus are called to embody and bear witness to this mutual dependence. As Meyer realizes, Jesus the Jew creates no distance for us in our relationship to him. His Jewish identity sustains our own Jewish identity. But the historical alienation of the two communities with which we identify opens up a different kind of otherness in our lives. Both our Jewish and Christian environments continually call into question that Jewish identity that Jesus has renewed and now sustains. Our uncanny, controverted presence within these two worlds parallels that of the King of the Jews. This is because we represent him in at least one particular sense, and the communal mutuality his resurrected Jewishness entails. If we did not sense his intimate presence as our resurrected royal brother, we would quickly retreat into a less ambiguous Jewish or Christian pattern of life. And in fact, that is the course that many Jewish believers of Jesus end up taking. Jewish kingship as servant kingship. To assert such a mutual, though asymmetrical, dependence between Jesus and the Jewish people would likely raise concerns for Meyer and other Christian theologians engaged in Jewish-Christian dialogue, and rightly so. There is a danger here of spiritualizing and Christianizing the gritty particularity of Jewish history, identity, and discourse. Under a philo-Semitic cloak might lurk a Christian religious imperialism, assuming hegemony over the partial truths of a subordinate Jewish religious tradition. I have already noted one source of protection against this danger, namely the dependence of this sovereign on his subjects. While they are more dependent on him than he is on them, he is, after all, their ruler and divine as well as human. He truly needs them in order to be himself a Jewish king of the Jews. As Meyer stresses, this intimacy between Jesus and the Jewish people creates a salutary distance between Jesus and the Church of the Nations, and even establishes Christian dependence upon a religious community socially external to itself. The Church's historical failure to acknowledge this dependence should chasten and humble her and help to guard against the imperialist temptation. Recovery of the title King of the Jews in its narrative context provides an additional source of protection against this temptation. And here in particular is where I allude to sections in this booklet. This title functions in the Passion narrative as Roman imperial ridicule, not primarily directed at Jesus himself, but at the Jewish people. The Roman authorities treat Jesus as a stand-in, a living effigy for this people whom they despise. They thereby signal their own power and superiority in relation to the Jewish people. But the gospel tradition turns this ridicule upside down, transforming it into a judgment of Roman imperial authority and of the Jewish rulers whom the Romans have co-opted. Pilate sees Jesus as a non-entity and sets him up as a fitting representative for the national non-entity to whom he belongs. The evangelists, on the other hand, see Jesus as the resurrected Lord and Messiah who dies and rises to redeem and glorify his people. Through this crucifixion, the Roman governor intends to humiliate the Jews. The evangelists imply that the event does the opposite. The synoptic story of the request of James and John, or their mother, anticipates and interprets the Passion narrative in just this way. The story contrasts the character of true leadership in Israel with the manner in which the Gentiles, and preeminently the Romans, exercise authority. James and John, thirsting for honor, wealth, and power, imitate the imperial despots who lorded over the Jews, rather than the master on his way to Golgotha. Jesus is the rightful king of Israel, and that means governing not for his own benefit, but for the benefit of his subjects. It also means governing in a way that equips those governed to become responsible agents rather than disempowered slaves. This interpretation of the Passion narrative warns us against conceiving of the Jewish kingship of Jesus along the lines of those Roman authorities whose ways, according to that narrative, he condemned. The hidden rule of the resurrected Messiah over Israel can only be viewed as that of the servant Lord who washes the feet of his disciples. He is the king who empowers his subjects to share in his rule. Such a vision fits well with the audacious rabbinic conception of authority, which asserts the independence of the sages, even from God, or at least from a bat kol, a heavenly voice, while at the same time including all of their independent rulings within the divine revelation to Moses at Sinai. Like the government of the God depicted in rabbinic literature, the royal rule of the resurrected Messiah unleashes Jewish agency. If Jesus is the living king of the Jews, who has ruled the Jewish people since his death and resurrection, his hidden messianic government has generated, or at least blessed, the emergence of that very tradition which has so boldly re-envisioned the relationship between divine sovereignty and responsible human action. The fact that his messianic government is veiled from those he governs only reinforces the servant character of his rule. Once we grasp the meaning of the title King of the Jews in the context of the Passion narrative, we will reject any triumphalist reading of Jewish history which assumes an established Christian image of Jesus and then superimposes it upon a simplified or spiritualized picture of the Jewish experience. Israel receives its name as a result of a wrestling match with God, and the Jewish people have never stopped wrestling. Israel's struggle with God is not a zero-sum competition, for the victory of each depends upon that of the other. This is how the God of Israel governs, and it is likewise the mode of authority exercised by his anointed one. In conclusion, Jesus as the future King of the Jews. To confess Jesus as the past and present King of the Jews is to affirm faith in a mystery, a reality now veiled from sight. To confess Jesus as the future eschatological King of the Jews is to hope in the mystery unveiled. The expectation that the Jews will convert to Christianity, I think a very unfortunate phrase, at the end of the age has long been a staple of Christian eschatological menus. It has also posed a stumbling block for post-Holocaust, post-supersessionist Christian theologians such as Barbara Meyer. Their resistance to this traditional motif is well justified. Triumphalist Christian thinking has pictured the revelation of Jesus to the Jews at the end of the age as a negation of the Jewish historical experience. In such a scheme, the Jesus revealed to the Jews is the King of the Gentiles. And the Jewish conversion to Christianity means the de-Judaization of the Jews. If Jesus is the past, present, and future King of the Jews, then the eschatological unveiling of this mystery will challenge, chasten, refine, and consummate the historical experience of both the Jewish people and the church. It will reveal the mutual dependence which each has persistently contested. It will do so by manifesting to the church of the Gentiles that their Lord is preeminently the King of the Jews, and by making known to the Jews that the name of their King has been, is, and forever will be Yeshua HaNotzri, Jesus of Nazareth. In the context of such an eschatological King of the Jews Christology, Jewish disciples of Jesus do more than witness to the mutual dependence of Israel and the church. Like John the Baptist, we bear witness to the coming one who, as King of the Jews, scandalizes both communities. Yet, as that very King, he also is the one who fulfills the truths guarded and treasured by each tradition and satisfies the longing of every heart. May he come soon, speedily, and in